All right, so today we're going to dive into a pretty sensitive and complicated conflict, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And we're going deep, all thanks to a UN report that came out really recently, March 13th, 2025, to be exact. And it makes some really serious accusations against Israeli forces, accusations that have sparked a lot of outrage and a lot of denial. And it's got a lot of people wondering, like, is this going to be some kind of turning point, or is it just another chapter in this, like, long, tragic story?
The language this report uses is really striking. It goes beyond just listing crimes. It directly accuses the Israeli forces of genocidal acts and sexual, reproductive, and other forms of gender-based violence. These are not terms that are used lightly in international law. And using them here really signals how seriously the UN is taking these accusations.
Yeah, those are some pretty loaded terms. So let's start with the genocidal acts. That immediately grabs your attention. The report specifically points to the systematic destruction of sexual and reproductive healthcare facilities as evidence, like we're talking maternity wards, even Gaza's main IVF clinic. So how does destroying healthcare facilities equate to genocide?
Well, genocide has a very specific legal definition. It requires proving the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. Destroying healthcare facilities, while horrific, wouldn't automatically mean that definition is met. However, the UN report is trying to build a case that this destruction, along with other alleged actions, is part of a larger and systematic attempt to harm the Palestinian population.
So it's not just about the act itself, but like the intent behind it. And proving intent in a situation like this, I imagine, can't be easy.
Exactly. Proving genocide in international courts is super complex. It requires gathering meticulous evidence, often in the middle of a conflict zone, and then piecing together a clear picture of intent, which can be way harder to prove than the acts themselves. This report is just the start of a long process, and whether it will ultimately lead to genocide charges remains to be seen.
Okay, that makes sense. Let's move on to the other weighty term, that sexual, reproductive, and other forms of gender-based violence. What exactly does that encompass?
It's a broad term that covers a huge range of acts, from verbal harassment and intimidation to physical and sexual assault. We're talking about everything from forced nudity to threats of violence targeting specific genitalia. The report alleges these acts are being used systematically to terrorize and dehumanize the Palestinian population, which adds another layer to their argument of potential genocide.
It's hard to even imagine the impact of that kind of systematic abuse. And how has the Israeli government responded to these accusations?
Well, their reaction has been strong, to say the least. Prime Minister Netanyahu has labeled the report blood libel, a term with a very loaded and inflammatory history.
Okay, I gotta admit, I'm not familiar with that term. Can you explain why it's causing such a stir?
Blood libel refers to the centuries-old anti-Semitic myth that accused Jewish people of using the blood of Christian children for ritual purposes. It was used to justify persecution and violence against Jewish communities throughout history. Netanyahu using this term is incredibly charged. He's basically accusing the UN of perpetuating anti-Semitic lies.
So he's not just disagreeing with the report, he's framing it as part of a long history of anti-Semitism. That's a powerful
Yeah.
and potentially dangerous rhetorical strategy.
Exactly. What's fascinating is how both sides are using language and historical narratives to frame the conflict and delegitimize the other side's views. It's a tactic we see often in these types of situations, and it brings up important questions about how this rhetoric can escalate tensions and make real meaningful dialogue nearly impossible.
And it doesn't stop there, right? Israel's foreign minister also weighed in with some strong words, right?
He did. He called the UN Council anti-Semitic and terrorist supporting, essentially dismissing the UN's authority and legitimacy.
So they're not just rejecting the report's findings, they're attacking the group that produced it.
That's right. This raises the question, what impact will this rhetoric have on international efforts to mediate the conflict? By basically writing off the UN, Israel risks isolating itself diplomatically and making it harder for outside parties to intervene or help come to a resolution.
This is already getting so complicated, and we're just scratching the surface. But before we go any deeper into these accusations against Israel, I think it's important to remember that this isn't the first time that the UN has investigated allegations of sexual violence in this conflict, right?
You're absolutely right. Back in 2024, there was a separate UN report that focused on actions allegedly committed by Hamas during their attack on Israel on October 7th. This report also concluded that there were reasonable grounds to believe that Hamas fighters committed acts of sexual violence.
Wow, so we have these incredibly serious allegations against both sides, and they're coming from UN investigations. Okay, so before we get into the specifics of each report, I'm curious about the evidence-gathering process itself. How does the UN go about investigating these types of claims, especially in a conflict zone?
The process is incredibly complex and challenging. Imagine trying to collect evidence from a crime scene that's also an active war zone. For this particular report, the UN Commission interviewed dozens of witnesses, reviewed thousands of photographs and hours of video footage, and examined medical records. They even analyzed patterns of damage to buildings to try to back up what witnesses were saying.
So they're not just relying on hearsay or anecdotal evidence. They're trying to build a case based on multiple sources and different types of data.
Exactly. However, it is important to note that because of safety concerns, they couldn't directly meet with many survivors of sexual violence, which of course makes verifying those specific allegations even harder.
That makes sense. It's a tough situation. Trying to be fair and thorough in the middle of an active conflict?
It definitely is. And even with all the evidence they collected, these reports are just one piece of a much bigger picture. They're a jumping off point for more investigation and dialogue, and hopefully accountability.
Okay, so we have these two UN reports, both alleging serious human rights abuses, including sexual violence. And these abuses were committed by both Israeli forces and Hamas. We've talked about how hard it is to prove genocide and the tricky process of gathering evidence in a conflict zone. But how do these reports fit into the bigger context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? I mean, this conflict has been going on for decades. There's so much history, so much baggage. Where do we even begin to untangle all of it?
You're right. This conflict is rooted in decades of occupation, displacement, and violence. Both sides have experienced a lot of pain and trauma. To really understand what's going on today, we need to look at the historical context and see how it shapes the present, and ultimately how these reports might impact the future.
All right, let's do it. Take us back to the beginning. What are the key events and things that have been driving this conflict for so long?
Well, one of the key turning points was the 1947 UN Partition Plan. It proposed dividing the territory of Palestine into separate Jewish and Arab states. On the surface, it might have seemed like a pretty reasonable solution, to try and ease the growing tensions between the Jewish and Arab communities.
Yeah, I can see how dividing the land might seem like a logical step. What happened? Why didn't it work?
Well, the plan faced pushback almost immediately. While Jewish leaders accepted the partition, Palestinian Arab leadership and the surrounding Arab states rejected it. They saw it as unfair, like something being forced upon them, on land they considered to be theirs. And the situation quickly went downhill, and it led to the 1948 Arab-Israeli War.
So the plan that was supposed to create peace actually started a war.
Unfortunately, yes. The war resulted in the establishment of the State of Israel. But it also led to the displacement of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, which created a refugee crisis that still exists today, this displacement, which is known as the Nakba, meaning catastrophe in Arabic. It's still a very traumatic event in Palestinian collective memory, and it fuels a lot of the resentment towards Israel.
That's heartbreaking. It sounds like this whole conflict is built on this tragic displacement and these competing claims to the same land.
You've hit a really important point there. The legacy of that war continues to shape the conflict even today. Fast forward to 1967, and we have the Six-Day War, where Israel gained control of the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem. These are all territories that the Palestinians claim for their own future state.
And this is where the idea of occupation comes in, right? What does living under occupation actually mean for the Palestinians living in those territories?
It means living under Israeli control, subject to Israeli laws and military authority, but without full citizenship rights or political autonomy. Imagine living in your own home, but another country controls your every movement, controls all your resources, and even your future. This situation creates a huge power imbalance that leads to a lot of resentment and mistrust. And as we can see in the recent UN report, it can create an environment where abuse is much more likely.
So the occupation isn't just some abstract political concept. It has a very real impact on the daily lives of Palestinians. And it seems like a major roadblock to any kind of peaceful solution.
Absolutely. The ongoing occupation is a major source of tension and a constant reminder of the issues at the heart of this conflict that are still unresolved.
Okay, so we've got this historical backdrop of displacement, war, and occupation. But then you've also got this ongoing political stalemate, with both sides dug into their positions.
Right. That's another big piece of the puzzle. There's a deep lack of trust between the two sides. They often cling to their own narratives, and they interpret the same historical events in totally different ways. This makes it incredibly difficult to find common ground and to negotiate a peaceful solution.
It feels like trying to solve a puzzle where the pieces keep changing shape. But surely there have been attempts at peace talks.
Right.
Have there been some glimmers of hope along the way?
There have been tons of peace initiatives and negotiations over the years. Some have been more promising than others, but they all seem to hit the same roadblocks. The status of Jerusalem, the right of return for Palestinian refugees, the borders of a future Palestinian state, and of course the question of security for both Israelis and Palestinians.
It's easy to see why these issues are so tough to resolve. They're tied to the very identity and survival of both groups of people.
Exactly. And when peace efforts have failed in the past, it's led to disillusionment and cynicism on both sides, making it even harder to picture a future where they can coexist peacefully.
So we're stuck with this incredibly complex and seemingly impossible situation. And then this new UN report, with its focus on sexual violence, throws yet another wrench into the works. How do you think this report might affect the already delicate balance of the conflict?
That's the big question everyone is trying to figure out. This report has the potential to drive the two sides even further apart. It could make them more entrenched in their positions and make dialogue even more difficult. Israel immediately rejecting the report and using terms like blood libel is pretty worrying. But there's always a chance, maybe even a small one, that this report could be a wake-up call, that it could push everyone to seriously rethink the current approach and lead to a renewed push for peace.
So it's kind of a choose-your-own-adventure situation. The path forward really depends on how both sides
And the international community.
choose to respond to this report.
And that's where the listener comes in. It's super important for people to engage with this issue, to learn about the complexities of the conflict, and to advocate for solutions that prioritize peace, justice, and human rights. Share information, support organizations working on the ground, reach out to your elected officials. These are all ways to make a difference.
It's easy to just want to give up and say, this is just too complicated, there's nothing I can do. But you're right, even small actions can help create a more peaceful future.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember, this report focuses on the horrible acts of sexual violence. But that's really just one part of a much bigger human tragedy. The question we all need to ask ourselves is, how do we break this cycle of violence and create a future where Israelis and Palestinians can live together in peace and dignity? It's a question without easy answers, but it's one that needs our attention and action.
Well said. So we've talked about the historical context and the political stalemate. We've seen how this UN report could either make things worse or maybe spark some positive change. But let's get back to the report itself. What are some of the specific things that it says Israeli forces have done?
The report details a really disturbing pattern of alleged actions. Everything from verbal harassment and humiliation to physical and sexual assault.
Can you give us some examples? I know it's a sensitive topic, but I think it's important to really grasp how serious these accusations are.
One example that really stands out is this practice of forced public stripping and nudity, where Israeli soldiers apparently forced Palestinian women to undress out in the open. Just imagine the humiliation and the trauma that something like that would cause.
That's awful. It's hard to even think about the psychological impact that would have. And the report says this wasn't just a one-time thing, right?
Right, unfortunately. The UN Commission heard testimony from many different witnesses describing similar events. They also collected accounts of sexual harassment, where Palestinian women described being groped or propositioned and subjected to really inappropriate comments from Israeli soldiers.
It's important to remember these are still allegations. But the fact that the UN felt like they needed to include them in the report makes you think they must have found them credible enough to be taken seriously.
Exactly. The report doesn't just list these incidents, it tries to put them into a wider context. It argues that these things aren't just random isolated events, committed by a few bad apples. Instead, it points to a more systemic pattern of behavior, possibly even condoned or encouraged by higher-ups.
So they're suggesting that there's some level of institutional complicity here, maybe even going all the way up the chain of command. That's a huge claim. What evidence do they have to back up something that serious?
Well, the report emphasizes just how widespread these allegations are. They got accounts from all over the occupied territories, which suggests that this behavior goes way beyond a few isolated cases. They also talk about the power dynamics that are built into the occupation, where Israeli soldiers have all this authority over Palestinian civilians, and they argue that this imbalance of power creates this environment where abuse can easily happen, and where the victims are often too scared to speak out.
It's like a classic case of power corrupting. And the more power there is, the more potential there is for things to go wrong. And sadly, we've seen this play out so many times in history, where occupying forces end up committing atrocities against the people they're supposed to be controlling.
Exactly. And the report goes even further than that. It argues that the Israeli government hasn't done enough to address these problems, and that this has created a culture of impunity, where the people who commit these acts are rarely held responsible.
So they're saying the Israeli government is either ignoring these abuses or actively trying to cover them up.
Yeah, you could interpret it that way. And it's a pretty serious accusation. And unsurprisingly, it's been met with a lot of anger and denial from Israeli officials.
It's hard to imagine how they can just dismiss these accusations. This UN report is a big deal, and it seems like it's based on a pretty thorough investigation.
You're right. But as we saw in their initial reaction, with the use of really inflammatory language like blood libel, it seems like they're more interested in attacking the UN than actually dealing with what the report says.
That's a real shame, because this report, as hard as it is to read, could actually be a chance for Israel to take a good look at itself and finally address these issues.
I agree. A real commitment to accountability and reform could go a long way towards rebuilding trust, not just with the Palestinians, but with the international community as a whole.
It seems like a missed opportunity, at least for now. But we shouldn't forget that the UN also investigated allegations of sexual violence committed by Hamas. The report they released back in 2024 focused on the group's actions during their attack on Israel on October 7th. Can you remind us what that report found?
Sure. That report was led by a UN expert named Pramila Patten, and it concluded that there were reasonable grounds to believe that Hamas fighters engaged in sexual violence during that attack on October 7th. They heard lots of disturbing accounts from witnesses, including allegations of rape and gang rape, mainly targeting Israeli civilians who got caught up in the violence.
So both sides have been accused of doing some really horrible things. It's a sad reminder that war just dehumanizes everyone, the perpetrators and the victims.
Absolutely. And the UN expert also voiced concern that the sexual abuse of Israeli hostages being held in Gaza was still ongoing when the report was published.
It's a stark reminder that even when people are trying to find peace, the cycle of violence continues and leaves so much trauma behind.
That's such an important point. These reports focus on specific acts of sexual violence, but they're really just one part of a much bigger and more deeply rooted pattern of violence that's been going on for way too long.
So how do we even begin to address this violence that's gone on for so long? I mean, we've talked about the history, the politics, the accusations. It feels so overwhelming. Is there even a way to find a path toward a more peaceful future?
It's a huge challenge, but I do think there's hope. I think understanding how complex this conflict is, acknowledging the pain and suffering on both sides, and holding the people who commit these crimes accountable are all crucial steps in the right direction.
Those sound like big steps. Where do we even start?
Well, I think a good place to start is by really looking at the details of these reports. By understanding the nature of these alleged abuses, we can start to get a handle on what's causing this violence and hopefully start to imagine a different kind of future.
We've gotten really deep on this one today, from those shocking details in the UN reports to this complicated history and political situation. It's a lot to take in. But for someone listening out there who's trying to make sense of it all, what's the main takeaway? Where do we go from here?
You know, if we look at this report in the bigger context, it's a sad reminder that this conflict is far from over. This cycle of violence continues, and both Israelis and Palestinians are suffering. But this report also highlights how important it is to hold people accountable. These allegations of sexual violence, committed by both sides, they need to be investigated. And the investigations need to be serious and impartial. If we ignore these crimes, it just makes true reconciliation even more difficult.
It's like this wound that never gets to heal. It just keeps getting reopened. And without justice, how can there ever be real peace?
Exactly. And beyond just accountability, this report also shows us that the current peace process, if you can even call it that, is failing. Something has to change. We need to see a real commitment to dialogue, more international pressure, maybe even a completely new way of thinking about the two-state solution. The way things are going now is just not working.
It feels like we're at a crossroads.
Right.
This report could either lead to real action, or it could just be dismissed as another awful chapter in a long and violent conflict.
Yeah.
What do you think is more likely to happen?
Well, it's impossible to know for sure. There's a real chance that this report could make both sides even more dug into their positions, leading to more blame and less willingness to compromise. The fact that Israel rejected the report so quickly is definitely concerning. But there's always a chance, even if it's a slim one, that this report could be the thing that shakes everyone up, that it could make them rethink their approach and renew their efforts to find peace.
So it's a bit of a choose-your-own-adventure situation. The way forward really depends on how both sides
And the international community.
decide to react to this report.
And that's why what the listener does is so important. It's crucial that people really engage with this issue, that they learn about this conflict and how complex it really is, and that they advocate for solutions that put peace, justice, and human rights first. Share information. Support the organizations doing work on the ground. Contact your elected officials. These are all ways to have an impact.
It's so easy to just feel overwhelmed and say, this is all too much, I can't do anything about it. But you're right, even small actions can help build a more peaceful future.
Absolutely. And we can't forget that this report, while it focuses on these horrible acts of sexual violence, is really just showing us one piece of a much bigger human tragedy. The question we all need to wrestle with is, how do we end this cycle of violence and build a future where both Israelis and Palestinians can live together in peace and with dignity? There aren't any easy answers, but it's a question that demands our attention and our action.
Well said. To everyone listening out there, thank you for joining us for this deep dive. It's been a tough conversation, but an important one. We hope you'll keep learning, stay engaged, and never give up hope for a more peaceful future.